Will Hawaii remain Hawaii without the knowledge of Hawaiian culture? Without it, what will make Hawaii distinctive? If we make no effort to preserve all we can, what then?
Kawena Pukui is without a doubt the most important Kanaka scholar of the 20th century. She herself was born into a family that was so rich with ʻike kupuna. Her grandmother was a kahuna la'au lapa'au.
She was raised by her grandmother, Liliʻuokalani, and they were inseparable. The summers they used to go down to, even as a little girl, she used to ride their mule and go down to kupuna, and they'd grow sweet potatoes up Mauka and take them down and distribute them to the family down by the shore. They'd stay about a week or so, two, in a temporary shelter. They'd fish, they'd gather salt.
She was born in 1895. During the first 20 years of her life, there might be 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 Hawaiian language newspapers published at a time, right? So you'd have a full range of different kinds of mana'o. And then when Kealakaʻi Hawaii went out of business, then there was only one nūpepa ʻōlelo Hawaii, and that went out of business in 1948. So she watched that community of people who could speak and read Hawaiian just shrink over time.
She was at Kawaiʻi Seminary for girls. When she was 15, at that time, speaking Hawaiian was against the laws. There was a young girl that came in from the country, didn't speak English, so she was trying to help her and explain to her in Hawaiian what you need to do. And she was overheard by one of the teachers. She was punished for a week by herself, made an example of, but she always wanted an education. So she could write a lot of the things that she knew and she experienced, and just for that, just for herself, just for the family, And I think she was in the first graduating class of Hawaiian Mission Academy. Her grandmother, Naliʻuokalani, was a dancer in Queen Emma's court. And she taught these dances to Kawena.
The honey of lehua blossoms is sipped by the birds. The yellow-skinned ava appears in the upland of Kaliʻu. The winds blow breaking down the leaves and the forest where the ava of puna grows. Your love reaches out to me.
1935 or so, somebody came knocking at the door. Her name was Keahiluahine. They became good friends, and she taught my grandmother and my aunt Namaka. My grandmother she was a ho'opa'a, and Namaka was a dancer. And that was really the reintroduction of hula kahiko, because, Hollywood, how they depicted Hawaiian was that kind of cellophane skirts and all of that. She also took from her cousin, Joseph Ilalaole, and he taught them Hawaii Island old dances.
I was up at Ahia, composed around 1875 in Ka'u, and given to him by his grandparents.
She wrote on notes on things like this, bits of paper. Now, this is an envelope, and I can't throw it away because she's got notes there.
She started when she was 15 years old, and she really never stopped. Everything from, looking at manuscripts and newspapers and pulling out the words and pulling out the ʻōlelo noʻeau and pulling out the stories.
It was just part of her. She didn't have to be told. She wasn't ordered to do this. It was in her to seek the knowledge, to learn the knowledge, and to write down the knowledge. Helen Roberts was a woman hired by the Territory of Hawaii in the early 1920s to record chants. The recordings were brought back to Bishop Museum. Then Mary Kawena Pukui went through these transcriptions, made hand notations of corrections if necessary, but then on the facing page, Kawena wrote line by line an English translation of the Hawaiian. Her ability and her connection to both cultures and her fluency in both languages enabled her to translate poetic Hawaiian into poetic English. For us to know now, in the 21st century, what this information is.
What about the untranslated material yet to be done in the museum, the archives, the legal documents in the land office? How are cases to be settled when the attorneys do not know what the words written on the documents mean?
She had done lots of translations, and she had always said that the material here in this library, it would take at least 2 of her lifetimes to make a dent in what was here. So she felt that the translators of the future would need something like this.
Hawaii needed a new Hawaiian dictionary. Mary Kawena Pukui and Sam Albert were asked to do it. Sam Albert was a student of hers, learning Hawaiian.
I felt that it was really her dictionary and that I was more or less a technician. She was full of poetry, and we filled the dictionary with quotations from songs and chants and sayings.
The kahiko and the okina were introduced to help people. For example, if you just use PAU, you wouldn't know if it's pau, pa'u, pa'u, pa'u. That was the first dictionary that was ever authored by a Hawaiian person, that 1957. But there was a lot of resistance, a lot of testifying at the legislature. Why should, we spend money on a dead language? People thought it was a dead language because there were only a few old folks that spoke it. And she was determined to preserve her mother tongue.
She knew that the younger people were not being taught ʻōlelo Hawaii. It wasn't valued. People were really propagandized into losing their sense of being Hawaiian and having that replaced with a sense of being American.
In 1960, she and Auntie Ellie, they went to all of the islands, and with this tape recorder, it was a reel-to-reel, and they interviewed the elders about their lives, their experiences, their family, and anything they wanted to talk about.
Kawena would carry a 3-ring binder like this on our field trips. She would never pick up a pencil while she was recording. And only after we left the people did she open up her binder and jot down notes.
And they took me with them in 1960 on a field trip. And we went to Hilo and Ka'u. We ended up at Hula Palace. Auntie Liliʻuokalani in Montgomery was the caretaker. And so she made me keep a journal. And we talk every day in the evening about what we did for the day. About the people that we saw. Kavelao Kakapu Kuana, very famous fisherman.
Without her work, our knowledge of Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian language would be so sparse. Her work is the foundation of the knowledge we have now. And it wasn't just the books or the publications of the projects which her name is associated or is on, because she consulted with and assisted countless people who came to her for knowledge.
In fact, she was here for a long time before she got hired.
Oyae, onahu okuneia oyae, naine yakukanahu oyae, henahu ho'oku ole oyae, no pa ulanei puhi oyae, nuka aino te tupuna ayae, ha'ina mai kapuana oyae, no puhi no ale.
So my mother was born in 1927, completely educated in English. She knew hundreds of Hawaiian songs, but was never taught to speak, never taught to read. And so my generation comes and we're taught almost nothing.
I am now exchanging knowledge with those interested in Hawaiian themselves, their thinking pattern, the why of some of their behavior. I tell them of the old, and they tell me of the new, and together we learn.
She retired from the Bishop Museum. She was invited by Richard Paglino, who was one of the social workers down at QOCC, because there are a lot of local and Hawaiian social workers. But when they went out in the field with the Hawaiian families, there's a lot of stuff that they encountered that Western teaching, never covered. All of the things they talked about resulted in ho'oponopono. And so she brought that back. I have the original study they did. And then Nana Ikikumu 1 and 2. And if you read it, the whole psychology of the Hawaiian soul, the Hawaiian thinking.
There's practices at home, but we don't understand them. And then you pick up Nana Ikekumu, and here's Kawena, and she explains it to you. She was the 20th century embodiment of Mo'oku Auhau consciousness. She was aware that the generations after her and after us, the generations in the future, were going to really need this knowledge. We need it to know who we are.
She faced a lot of criticism in her life for documenting, for transcribing, for sharing knowledge, because her whole point was it isn't just to keep it and write it down, but for others to hear it and read it and know it.
And she said, I'm doing this for my moʻopuna. And someday yours will benefit too.
Knowledge, to me, is life. Ua mau kea o ka ʻāina i ka pono.